From Utah Public Radio, this is Undisciplined. I'm Matthew LaPlante. What would you do if you were hiking and saw the start of a wildfire? If it was very small, like a campfire that had been left unattended, that had just barely jumped its pit, you might personally try to put it out. But whether you personally did something or not, you'd almost certainly alert someone else who could do something about that fire. And that's because you know how dangerous fire can be. And the ecologist Paul Rogers says that's natural. Fire screams for us to do something. The response for the past century has been to put those blazes out as quickly as possible. But in hindsight, that wasn't always the best long term strategy. It's often thought that's because a lack of small fires means forest debris accumulated, becoming fuels for even bigger fires. And that might be true in some cases. In other situations, though, the truth is that fire is just going to happen. It's always happened in these places in the West where we are now increasingly choosing to live. And yet, Rogers says, we go on battling these flames with boundless budgets and military bravado. There is increasing consensus that this isn't the way forward, especially not in a warming world. But there's less agreement on what to do next. But what should we do instead? Rogers has taken on that question in a chapter in a new book called A Watershed Moment: The American West in the Age of Limits. The chapter is called At Home with Forest Fires in the West. Rogers is an adjunct professor in the Department of Environment and Society. He's a USU Ecology Center associate, and he's the director of the Western Aspen Alliance. He also worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 16 years, where he conducted monitoring activities and published results from the interior of the United States. Rogers has also been a repeat customer here on Undisciplined, having joined us several times in the past to talk about wildland ecology. Paul Rogers, welcome back.
It's really nice to be here with you, Matthew.
Paul, you chose to start your story in a little town called Island Park, just outside of Yellowstone. Why Island Park?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. Well, I wasn't very interested in those iconic Western towns that are full of money and resources and large homes and getaway spots. Oh yeah, all over the place. And to come right to the rub here, they have resources. They can do things. They can alter their vegetation around their homes. In fact, they'll pay for somebody else to do it. But what if you're more of a hard scrabble or working class getaway, a place that's been around for decades, under the radar, you might say, but it's where the working class goes to take a break in the summer. There's not a lot of money. There's small homes that they're overwhelmed with dense forests. Got all kinds of issues that don't really bode well for an out of control fire, really overrunning a community. And we've seen this in Fort McMurray in Canada, and we've seen this in Paradise, California, and other places. What happens when the regular town, the one without all the resources, comes up against something, a force of nature, really?
Because as you write, places, like Vail, like Park City, they have the resources to just write a check to become a little more fire wise if they decide as a community that's important.
That's exactly right, and not only at an individual level, but at a community level. They're going to have more tax dollars. They're going to have more resources at that level as well, and so they're unlikely to go up in flames. Whereas a place like this, it's more about you and me and the people we know. How do they face such a large incident? And ideally, how do they face it before it comes? That's really a lot about what this chapter is about. And we take the community of Island Park and its projection across many, many Western locales.
And that's still the case in Island Park, right? There hasn't been a large fire that swept through there yet.
Right. Yeah, I make the point that this place was born of fire, but millions of years ago. It's the less known adjacent caldera, a volcanic cone, less known to its neighbor, which is known as Yellowstone National Park, is almost entirely inside of a volcanic cone. And the types of soils that are there, rhyolitic soils, and the trees that grow on them, predominantly lodgepole pine, they live and thrive over centuries on infrequent but very intense fires.
The work that needs to be done to make places like Island Park more fire-wise is really being done by individual homeowners and landowners. And this is in part because in many ways, as you write, Idaho epitomizes the libertarian bent that limits massive civic action and really champions this idea of personal attention to issues rather than civic action.
That's right, and have to tell you, this is why I'm excited at this point in my career to be in a department like at USU called Environment and Society, because we have a lot of gap to bridge, you might say, between what we know in our science and our ecology, and how we react to that as communities, as individuals and communities, sort of where sociology meets ecology, right there on the landscapes in front of us. So coming down to that specific situation in Island Park where we have this go it alone attitude. And well, that butts up against, when we have big things that happen on the landscape level or on the national level or even on the global scale, we need to figure out how to communicate and cooperate to take collective action. And that's a little hard for us, particularly in the American West, with this ethos of the heroic individual.
It's interesting you say that because I've worked really hard to keep the land around my home as fire wise as possible. I put in a lot of hours, clearing the forest around the place where I live. Um, and I look around and I see my neighbors, and some of them are doing the same thing, and some of them are not. But there's this thing inside of me where if my town tells me to do it, or if my city or like my state or my county tells me to do it, I don't want to do it as much, right? I want it to be me and I want my neighbors to do it, but I don't want to be told to do it. I think that's that Western seed inside of me.
Yeah, I think we all have a bit of that. But to sort of counter that, when we've taken any collective actions, there's kind of a good feeling at the end of the day that we did something together. So we have these kind of countering feelings within our minds and within our societies. And I always tell people, if you think about the big things we've done, where we're really proud of our nation or how we responded, we have this phrase, the greatest generation. That wasn't a bunch of individuals. That was people really coming together with things like the CCC and our collective response in World War II and other hard times in our country. Imagine if it was just a bunch of individuals. We got to kind of come together and collectively work for some broader good outcome that's bigger than any one of us.
And fire prevention or fire strategies are one of those things. I mean, this is a risk that we all in the West now face. Let's put this into a little bit of historical context. During Aboriginal stewardship and early European settlement, fire was often used as a tool for farming and land clearance. And then two really important things happen. One is that the timber industry just skyrocketed and forests were increasingly seen as agrarian resources to which fire was a risk. And then, second, you write in your chapter, there was this breakpoint in 1910 when an inferno in the northern Rockies took more than 3 million acres and claimed 86 lives. And a year after that, a federal law is passed to formally prohibit native and settler burning traditions across the nation. And kind of from that point on, it seems our policy was increasingly aimed not at using fire and certainly not at allowing it to do what it has always done in these environments long before we were here, but really our policy was fighting fire.
That's right. And if you think in a broader aspect, the greater arc of natural resource management in this country and this on this continent, we kind of shift over from a natural or subsistence kind of economies and interactions with the environment to this larger engineering or what's formerly known as command and control. It's kind of places humans outside the environment, but also we're smarter. We can do this. We got this covered. And we had a probably a good strong 80, 90, 100 years of that kind of thinking to where we have command over this subject. And one of those central touch points of that era is we're going to control and put out fires. Now, I make a strong case here and elsewhere that we had little effect, that our fire suppression had maybe greater effect at lower elevations and less so as you go up in elevations. But what really controls fire and other elements is the climate, as the climate fluctuates. And in today's day and age, we're forecasting, we're future projecting climate, but we're not taking a very close look at the wettest century in the last millennium or two in our region of the country,
Which was the 20th century.
the 20th century. So here we're kind of marching along with our chests puffed out, thinking, "Hey, we're pretty good at this. We're stopping these fires as a general rule." But what's really doing it is, we grew up, so to speak, in the firefighting world with a big advantage. And now that things have shifted, and I want to be very pointed that I am not invoking climate change yet, but things have shifted to a more droughtier period, which we've always had through times, wet periods and droughty periods. We should expect more fire and we should expect the system to burn more.
There's kind of a beautiful opportunity here, right? Because a lot of the people that, for instance, we can, I think, pretty safely assume that a lot of people who live in Island Park might be a little bit hesitant or resistant culturally, but you don't have to convince them that climate change is happening, is that it is human caused, in order to communicate to them that climate has changed as a result of just natural climate variability, right? Like, we had a wetter century in the 20th century, we're now on a drier century, and that by itself, even if we don't talk about human caused climate change, causes greater risk and causes us to have to think about how we interact with our wildlands in a different way.
Yeah, I think you're right on point, Matthew. I think people generally acknowledge that human caused climate change is a factor here. The really tough part here, and I don't think we're there yet, others may disagree with me, is decoupling natural fluctuations, you might say, in droughty and wet periods from an extraordinary warming of the planet. And we're getting going on that, and it is reasonable to think that we're going to have a more consistent pattern of obviously warmness. It's a little harder to predict precipitation, but certainly a warming, and those two things interact with each other as well. So many factors going on here, but people are on board. I think generally, what I'm actually concerned about is you might say too much on board, is that folks find this thing so big and daunting that they feel helpless. If there's a cliff ahead of us, this is my infamous Thelma and Louise analogy. If there's a cliff, do we keep pushing the accelerator or do we work in that space between us and the cliff? And that's what's known as resilience. If we've tipped some ecosystems into a non resilient state, that's where we can do some real work to make a difference while we slow down, we hope, that long-term pattern of climate warming through cutting carbon, essentially. So we're always addressing things at least two scales, but in the immediate future, what can we do that's productive and is going to work in the positive direction to make a more resilient system to a changing climate, while we're also working on that long-term problem of a warming planet.
And this brings us back to Island Park. A 2013 poll found that only 29% of Island Park residents were expressed willingness to take actions like thinning trees adjacent to homes, and even fewer were on board with things like replacing roofs with fireproof materials or widening access roads to the cabins that were even more dispersed from the main town. That's a really difficult starting place toward the goal of fire resilience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Island Park is different in that it's kind of a diffuse town. You might have a hard time identifying when you're in the center of town as you drive through that area. So that's already problematic in terms of dealing with a collective community and fire. But yeah, so we're ping ponging back and forth between physical science and sort of community or public understanding and action. And now we're back in this realm of so, how are the people reacting? And there's resistance. Interestingly, folks said in that same poll that either one, the firefighters, and I have to say parenthetically, federal firefighters would handle this, or two, my insurance will cover it. Everything's cool.
And the federal firefighters thing is interesting because this is a region of the country, and there are many regions of the country like this, where there is a lot of reticence to federal involvement in local matters. And yet, as you point out, Idaho receives $1.25 in federally funded programs for every dollar that it sends to the federal government.
Yeah, so we're pressing right up against that sort of libertarian thinking. There's a general idea that, federal government stay out unless we really need you. And boy, are we going to need you when when those flames come over the hilltop and they're come towards town. But as we said at the outset of this discussion, there's not overwhelming resources to deal with this. So it's a little bit I can do on my own, or hey, let's just let her ride and I hope the firefighters are on my side at the right time, or my, in the last case, worst case scenario, my insurance covers it, and we really hope, all of us hope, nobody gets hurt. But this is kind of a tinderbox, a hazardous situation, again replicated in many places across the West, that's ready to blow up.
You visited Island Park in 2022. And you saw some Firewise efforts, but you also saw what you just described as a tinderbox, like these native conifers overhanging wood decks and these thick carpets of shed needles and firewood stacked against the exterior walls of cabins. I mean, like all of these things that you were probably, it was probably all you could do not to just like walk up to some people's doors and knock on the door and go like, "Hey, buddy."
Yeah. In fact, I saw, I was lucky enough to see an individual trimming some lower branches from around his house. And I went up to him. He was very skeptical. I'm quote unquote an outsider, just a guy walking around with a camera. But, we had a congenial conversation. But, the conversation ended. I said, "What do you think about all this in the future?" And he said, "It's every man for himself. And I'm doing what I can here when I can." Maybe he's a part-time resident. I didn't get that deep with him, but he was doing a little trimming in his spare time. It wasn't an all-out effort, and it wasn't a community effort. And there are some folks starting to organize there, but it's a minority, and we hope that builds up some steam. And there's some larger federal efforts. There's a U.S. highway that runs down the center of this community, and they're trimming the trees back from the highway because that's where a lot of fires start. Is somebody throwing something out the window that may be flammable? So there are some efforts starting to happen there, but from the individual in a home in a cabin, this person encapsulated kind of that general feeling of we're on our own here.
You have pointed out that common sense and legal restrictions keep us from building in floodplains. And there isn't a forest corollary. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, isn't that funny? I mean, flooding is a climatic incident, right? And it happens around the country. What about hurricanes? We have those too, and frankly, we do build in hurricane-prone places quite a bit, and sometimes floodplains. But we have this phrase that's commonly, used in our culture: "Don't we don't build in a floodplain?" But what about in a sort of firescape? We do build in firescapes. And part of that is the complacency that was built up over the last century. And everyone's going to have that beautiful house at the end of the road. I would love to live in the forest. It's wonderful. But what we don't quite get, all the way from the marketing to the individual homeowner, is that these are changing and dynamic systems. We think that it's going to be this beautiful forest this way around us, and we don't fully understand our environment and the potential hazards that are likely to come. And if it doesn't come this year, it's going to come in 10 years or maybe 100 years. We're not going to have real estate agents saying, "Hey, and by the way, here's the hazards of living here." It's all go, go, go. It's like our consumer society. Let's buy more, more, more. And that's problematic when we get to these situations where we're moving into known hazardous areas. So that's my number one sort of, you might say, what to do for the future here is let's step back, press the pause button, and think a little bit more about where we build.
These are challenges of social psychology, public education, communications, just as much as they are scientific challenges. And there's a section in your chapter where you give a little bit of a prescription for addressing those sorts of challenges. Can you read a little from that part? It starts with "in our haste."
In our haste to lay blame for modern conflagrations, a cabal of managers, media, and some scientists have invoked increasing drought. However, what's really new is the growing number of structures and sometimes lives in the path of predictable flames. Rather than curtail forest sprawl directly, a woe is me stance emerges. Something bad is being done to us. And in the newspeak, we use these terms devastation, destruction, loss, charred, tragedy, and so on. Rather than the inflammatory language, we should kindle conversations based on ecological opportunity and social connection with wildlands. Policy strategies grounded in complexity, preparedness, and acceptance of the unpredictable will be crucial. Climate change and its evolving linkages to Western forest fires are daunting, but framing these challenges as frightening enemies too large to overcome discourages constructive engagement. Positioning ourselves in an adaptive stance involves learning while doing and nimble responses based on documented experience. So here again, I'm dancing between the ecological and the sociological or culture, and that's tough ground. There's a lot of unknown there, and so how we can position ourselves for the unknown and to be adaptive, not only in this work but in my life's work, is kind of where I'm thinking a lot these days.
You started your chapter in Island Park, Idaho, in pretty much in the present day, but this story in many ways for you begins on Storm King Mountain near Glenwood Springs in Colorado back in 1994. Tell me about that experience for you.
Yeah, as you say that, I'm not afraid to say I get a little emotional just thinking about that. But in my job at the time, I was wandering the West taking forest measurements for the U.S. Forest Service, and we had an R&R weekend in Glenwood Springs. And as I drove out of town after the Fourth of July weekend to my next destination, I just got on the interstate and drove like anybody, but I just noticed this small crew of a few vehicles and people sort of preparing to go up the mountain. I'd done some firefighting in my earlier career, and so I knew the look and feel of that. They're getting their Pulaski axes, and they have their Nomex clothes on, and they have their hard hats, and so on, and they're getting ready to go up this mountain, up this gulch, right off the interstate. And I drove by and thought not much of it. I could see a little waft of smoke up there. And to make a long story short, a few hours later, I arrived at my destination. I could see the same billowing smoke, but it was huge. It was going up into the stratosphere. And I think everybody knows this story, but many of those people that I saw at the roadside heading up that gulch died in a terrible tragedy when that fire rushed up that gulch like a chimney and overran them. Some of them made it over the ridge, but most did not. And that's the tragedy and that we have in putting people out in these situations. I have to say there really weren't nearby homes, and we wonder why are we doing these things. It's almost like there's inertia. There's a juggernaut going on that when we see smoke and flames, we run out and put it out. But it turns out that that could have more damaging negative impact in the long run than not. Not to mention life and property are lost, and we just hate that anybody hates to see those kind of situations arise. But it kind of sums up where we are. We're having this battle, but we're not sure why sometimes.
That's Paul Rogers. He's an adjunct professor in the Department of Environment and Society, and a USU Ecology Center associate, and the director of the Western Aspen Alliance. And he's also the author of a chapter on forest fires and a new book called A Watershed Moment: The American West in the Age of Limits. Paul Rogers, thank you.
It's really nice to be here. I appreciate it.
Undisciplined is a production of Utah Public Radio, and if you happen to live in Utah, you can listen to us on UPR every Thursday morning at 10:30. If you miss us, then you can listen to every episode of Undisciplined wherever you get your podcasts. Our program is supported by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Utah State University, and from listeners like you, you can support our work at donate.nprstations.org/UPR. Our producer is Reagan Edelman. Our theme music is Little Idea by Benjamin Tissot, and I'm Matthew LaPlante. Thanks for listening. Now go have big ideas.